Last time, I said 30,000 Horus probably had an edge on the lion. One comment disagreed. 69 people showed up to fight about it. That comment pulled 120 likes in a 742 comment section. The second highest reply count in the entire thread was less than half that figure. Two factions formed immediately, sorted themselves into opposing piles, and spent the rest of the thread doing what this audience does when it gets serious, citing books at each other. That level of organized disagreement doesn't get ignored. It gets a trial. Both sides will have their best case presented as rigorously as the lore allows. At the end, there's a verdict. One primarch named as better, reason stated. No diplomatic evasion, no "it depends on the scenario," no retreat into "they're both extraordinary warriors," hedging that the audience correctly reads as cowardice. Before the evidence, the rules of engagement need to be established, because both factions have advocates who will contest the boundaries the moment it serves them. This is 30,000 only, Great Crusade era, pre-corruption, pre-ascension, pre-everything that turns the dial from primarch to something categorically different. Horus has two major power escalations in the lore, and the line between them matters. The first is Davin, placed at circa 000.M31 by the Lexicanum's Horus Heresy timeline. A chaos ritual heals a near-fatal wound, and Horus emerges with his allegiances permanently rewritten. His psychology shifts, his motivation structure collapses and rebuilds in a new direction. Whether this event physically augments his combat capabilities is genuinely contested across the lore community, and nobody fully wins that argument. The second escalation is Molech in 007.M31. That's unambiguous. The Warhammer 40k fandom wiki is explicit. Horus enters a gate, spends what feels like an eternity inside the warp, and emerges with capabilities the Liber Hereticus places beyond anyone except possibly the Emperor himself, eclipsing all his brothers in might and physically towering over them. Molech-era Horus is excluded from this trial without debate. To be fair to both factions, the cutoff for this trial is the Horus who existed before Davin, the War Master at the height of the Great Crusade, before any corruption contaminated the record. The defense actually believes this version of Horus may be the most genuinely dangerous version that ever existed. Chaos amplified his raw power, but simultaneously fractured his psychology, introduced internal wars between his own factions that occupied processing he'd previously spent entirely on external threats. Pre-Davin Horus is the version where everything he was, the 3 decades of accumulated experience, the coalition building, the absolute weapon knowledge, is unified and pointed at a single objective. On the Lion side, the M42 Awakened version is excluded. The Lion who returns to the Imperium in Mike Brooks's novel, The Lion, Son of the Forest, waking from 10,000 years of stasis with new abilities the 30k Lion didn't possess, is a different entity. Both factions accept this condition. The Luther duel is inadmissible. It occurred after the heresy concluded, placing it outside the time window this trial examines. The Lexicanum's Horus Heresy timeline confirms the destruction of Caliban as a post-heresy event. No exceptions. One piece of calibration evidence belongs here before the trial proper, because it establishes what the upper ceiling of primarch combat actually looks like without demonic involvement. In Slaves to Darkness by John French, Perturabo, the Iron Warrior's primarch, a being whose brothers wouldn't describe him as the setting's premier melee specialist, defeats Daemon Primarch Angron in direct combat. He defeats and captures a demonic version of a primarch simultaneously, while Fulgrim is attempting to kill him from a separate direction. The point isn't Perturabo, the point is the ceiling. Unascended primarchs operating at full capacity can beat demonic versions of other primarchs. Both primarchs in this trial are operating well within that ceiling. Neither side should overstate or understate what tier of combat is being discussed here. The prosecution's case begins with a grammatical observation that the Lexicanum's own editors made without apparently noticing its implications. The Canonical Reference Wiki describes Lyon L. Johnson's strategic brilliance and martial prowess as rivaled perhaps only by Horus. Not Horus rivaled by the lion. The direction runs the other way. The lion's prowess is the established noun. Horus is the comparative challenger being measured upward toward it. In a construction like this, the subject is the standard, and the qualifier is the one being evaluated. The prosecution's opening argument rests on the position that the lore's canonical grammar isn't accidental. The direction of a comparison in a reference document that has existed across multiple editions reflects how the source material understands the hierarchy between these two specific primarchs. Prosecution Exhibit A, the Paragon. Lyon L. Johnson was the first primarch created by the emperor. His legion is the first. His cognomen is the first. He was first created, not first discovered. Horus was found first, which is a fact about where his gestation pod landed when the primarchs were scattered across the galaxy by chaos in late in-30. Being first created is a fact about the emperor's own design sequence, meaning the lion was the opening proof of concept, the primarch around whom the entire project crystallized. David Geimer's 2020 novel, Lyon L. Johnson, Lord of the First, the 13th entry in the Horus Heresy Primarch series, frames the lion's identity with specific language the prosecution is going to handle carefully. The Lexicanum's description of that novel states he is the paragon of what it is to be a primarch. His legion typifies the virtues of temperance, pride, and martial excellency that the primarch archetype is supposed to embody. The prosecution is being precise here because the verbatim phrase, template from which other primarchs were designed, is community shorthand, not a confirmed direct quote from the novel's text. What the confirmed language gives the court is paragon. Paragon means exemplar, the model against which other examples are measured. The functional difference between paragon and template is smaller than the defense will argue, but the prosecution uses the word the source material actually uses. Then there's the emperor's own assessment, delivered in person, in direct speech, inside that same novel. An excerpt from Lord of the First places the emperor meeting the lion aboard the Imperator Somnium to congratulate him on his latest campaign. The emperor's words, "You weren't the first of my sons to reclaim a place at my side, but your tally of victories is second to no other." The emperor is explicitly ranking the lion's combat and campaign record as the highest among all primarchs. Not Horus, the lion. This is the individual who had watched all 20 of his sons in action, who'd personally fought alongside Horus for 30 years and seen everything the War Master could do, and his assessment was that the lion's tally was unmatched. The prosecution submits this as the single most authoritative piece of direct evidence in the case. An in-universe ranking by the most qualified judge in the setting, delivered without political motivation and without hedging. Alongside it sits a secondary exhibit that deserves separate attention. A Chaos emissary dispatched to Lorgar, a being with full intelligence access to the entire Primarch roster and strong motivation to understand which one represented the greatest individual threat, identified the lion by a specific title. He called him the duelist, not the general, not the strategist, not the commander of coalitions, the duelist. In a setting where Primarch identities are combat-coded by design, what an adversary with comprehensive intelligence access chooses to emphasize about you isn't incidental. The enemies of the Imperium surveyed 20 Primarchs and named the lion as the one whose identity was built on individual combat supremacy. They didn't choose Horus for that specific designation. Whatever role Horus occupied in their intelligence assessment, it wasn't the one that ended conversations about individual fighting supremacy. Prosecution Exhibit B, the record on the table. The defense will argue, correctly, that Horus has more documented narrative real estate in the Horus Heresy novel series. Horus Rising, the first novel in the entire 54-book main sequence, centers Horus as the protagonist. The Luna wolves are the lens through which the audience first understands the setting. This is narrative asymmetry, not capability asymmetry, and the prosecution acknowledges it openly because arguing against it would waste the court's time and the audience's patience. What the prosecution argues instead is that the fights the lion does have on record are specific and comparatively data-rich in ways that matter for this particular question. The Dulon incident is the prosecution's primary feat exhibit. The setup. Lion L. Johnson killed a warlord on Dulon that Lehman Russ had claimed for himself. This wasn't a diplomatic disagreement. The lion killed the target, and Russ took it as a direct insult to his honor. Russ struck the lion. What followed wasn't a brief exchange. The Warhammer 40K fandom wiki, drawing on Black Library sources, records its duration as a full solar day and night, 24 hours. Two primarchs throwing each other across the terrain on Dulon, neither one stopping the other from recovering and pressing again. The engagement sustaining long past any point where normal exhaustion would have ended it. The recorded outcome is direct, the two combatants being said to be equally matched. While Russ was slightly stronger, the lion was slightly quicker. This needs context to land with the weight it carries. Lehman Russ isn't a moderate primarch. He's the Emperor's chosen executioner, the son sent when the message to be delivered was absolute and permanent. In Guy Haley's novel Wolfsbane, published 2018, Russ tracks Horus to the vengeful spirit after Molech, boards it with space wolves, and engages the War Master directly. He drives the spear of Russ into Horus's side. The wound is so severe it sends Horus into a coma-like state that nearly unravels the traitor coalition, forces Malachhurst into increasingly desperate improvisation, and occupies a significant portion of the subsequent heresy narrative before being resolved. The Russ who inflicted that wound and the lion who fought that same Russ to a 24-hour stalemate are operating in the same tier. If the lion and Russ are equally matched across a sustained engagement, and Russ's combat tier includes seriously wounding Horus under heresy conditions, then the lion's physical placement is equivalent to Horus's, and within that tier, the lion is the faster of the two. At Primarch combat velocities, the margin between a blocked strike and a decisive wound can be measured in fractions of milliseconds. A confirmed speed advantage, even a marginal one, within a sustained duel between equally matched opponents is a structural factor that accumulates. The Dulon brawl lasted a solar day and night. In that duration, marginal speed doesn't appear once. It appears on every single exchange. The prosecution asks the court to multiply that margin across the full length of time. The lion sword adds specific weapon evidence. The Lexicanum entry on the weapon confirms it was crafted on Terra by the Emperor's own hands, described as shining with a pale inner light and igniting whatever it cut with a sudden burst of flame. The lion briefly lost it during the Dulon brawl with Russ. The Lexicanum notes this specifically, and, per the same source, never let a weapon slip from his fingers again. That sentence, sitting quietly in a weapons entry, is one of the few places in the lore where a Primarch's relationship to a specific defeat or near miss is translated directly into a described behavioral change. The lion noticed what happened, processed it, and adjusted. In his subsequent confrontation with Conrad Kurz in Angels of Caliban by Gav Thorpe, the lion's sword cuts through Kurz's nightmare mantle with ease. Kurz is among the most dangerous Primarchs in individual combat in the entire setting. His specific advantage is unpredictability, precognitive ability, and the kind of violence that made him feared enough that the Emperor eventually issued specific orders about how to handle him. A blade that goes through his armor without apparent resistance isn't a ceremonial tool. The fighting style evidence comes from within Lord of the First itself. The novel describes the lion's way of thinking as not distinctly logical or rational, in the same way as Guilliman or Dorn, more primal, animalistic, instinctive. This is presented in the novel as the explanation for why other primarchs found him difficult to fully predict or understand, despite his obvious excellence. He doesn't run the tactical subroutines that other highly intelligent primarchs run. His combat responses emerge from a layer below where strategic insight can map them in real time. The prosecution presents this as a specific structural advantage against Horus, whose greatest single combat and strategic skill is reading the person in front of him and deploying exactly the right pressure at exactly the right moment. Horus won battles, won primarchs to his side, navigated brother primarchs who hated each other into temporary cooperation, all through an instinctive reading of human psychology that is described throughout the fandom wiki's Horus entry as his primary genius. The lion doesn't process information in ways that Horus's most refined skill can map cleanly. Against the lion, Horus can't do the thing he does best with maximum efficiency. He'd have to win through pure physical output. That's exactly where the lion's 24-hour track record with Russ is most relevant. The foundation of those instincts predates the Emperor's discovery of him by an indeterminate span. Lion L. Johnson led the Knights of Caliban on a 10-year campaign to exterminate the great beasts of the forests, creatures large and dangerous enough to have kept Caliban a death world across its entire recorded history. Before any imperial contact, before any augmentation, armed with only what a feudal knight carried into those forests. His instincts for killing things substantially more dangerous than himself were the bedrock before anyone trained anything into him. The prosecution argues this matters specifically because instinctive response patterns of that depth aren't overlaid by subsequent training. They become the foundation that all subsequent capability is built upon. Prosecution Exhibit C, the Corax problem. This exhibit was submitted by the audience, not by the prosecution, and the prosecution is using it because the audience that raised it understood its evidentiary value precisely. Ravenlord, a novella by Gav Thorpe collected in the Corax anthology published in October 2016, includes a moment where Corvus Corax reflects on a specific confrontation with Horus during the Great Crusade. The wording, directly from the novella. I struck Horus once for usurping the victories of the Raven Guard for his own glory, a moment that no doubt festers in the War Master's thoughts. He struck Horus. The blow landed. Horus's pride carried the mark of it into the future. Understand who Corvus Corax is in the Primarch combat hierarchy. Corax built the Raven Guard around stealth, infiltration, rapid strikes from concealment, and the deliberate avoidance of sustained direct engagement. Thorpe's characterization across his Raven Guard works is consistent. Corax's preference was always to fight by stealth, the way he had learned in his youth, using rapid strikes, sabotage, infiltration, and guerrilla tactics. The documented disagreement between Corax and Horus during the Crusade era was specifically about this. Horus pushing Corax to engage more conventionally, Corax refusing because he understood that sustained direct combat wasn't the Raven Guard's comparative advantage. They had this argument enough times that it eventually ended in a physical confrontation in the middle of what the novella frames as a dispute over Horus claiming credit for Raven Guard victories. This isn't a prepared duel. It isn't a Primarch who specializes in sustained melee engagement stepping into a ring with Horus. It's a Primarch who spends his life specifically not fighting that way, in the middle of an argument about credit and glory, striking Horus hard enough that the War Master remembers it and would presumably still be thinking about it at the time Corax narrates the recollection in Ravenlord. The prosecution is explicit that this is inference, not direct evidence. The Corax blow doesn't prove Horus is easy to hit in a sustained fight. What it proves is that in a charged confrontation he wasn't fully prepared for, a Primarch who isn't a melee specialist landed a strike that left a mark on his pride. Not metaphorically, but in the specific, documented sense that Corax believes it still bothers Horus. Extrapolating from that single data point to the lion, who fought Leman Russ for a full solar day and night and was named the Duelist by beings with full intelligence access to all 20 primarchs, is a short inferential step. Not a certainty, a reasonable step. The defense doesn't dispute that the lion is an exceptional combatant. The defense would be making a weaker case if it tried, and the audience would notice. What the defense disputes is the structure of the prosecution's evidence, because that structure is almost entirely definitional. Labels, descriptions, canonical framings applied to the lion by third parties and by authorial positioning. The prosecution describes what the lion should be able to do based on what the lore says he is. The defense has an event, something that specifically happened to Horus and didn't happen to any other primarch in the setting. Defense Exhibit A, the 30 years. The Horus Heresy timeline on the Lexicanum places the Great Crusade's opening and Horus's discovery at circa 798 M30. Leman Russ is discovered at 819 M30, 21 years later. Lion L. Johnson is discovered at 846 M30, 48 years after Horus was already fighting alongside the Emperor. Not 15 years, not a generation gap. 48 years of the Great Crusade's opening campaigns had already passed before the lion stood beside the Emperor for the first time. For 3 decades from the opening of the Great Crusade, the Horus fandom wiki is unambiguous. For 30 standard years, the Emperor and Horus fought the opening campaigns of the Great Crusade side by side, the Primarch learning at the foot of his sire. This appears in multiple independently corroborating sources: the Horus Wiki entry, the Lexicanum's Horus Lupercal entry, and the broader chronological framing of the Great Crusade narrative. When the Emperor finally departed to locate another Primarch and left Horus in command of the Principia Imperialis fleet, the fandom wiki records that the lessons he had learned in the previous 3 solar decades served him well. The language is explicit about causality. 3 decades produced transferable, applicable learning that affected measurable outcomes when Horus operated independently. Something from those years followed him into solo command. The defense anticipates the prosecution's objection about the nature of this learning and addresses it precisely. The 30 years weren't structured sparring sessions in a gymnasium. They weren't martial curriculum delivered in controlled conditions. The Emperor and Horus fought the opening campaigns of the Great Crusade side by side, meaning live combat against real opponents across dozens of worlds across 3 consecutive decades. What the prosecution will call merely shared battlefield experience, the defense calls the only form of learning that matters at Primarch level. The ceiling is too high for any training environment to replicate. You learn by fighting things that can kill you, alongside something that fights better than anything you've ever encountered, for 30 years, with no gap in the curriculum and no safety net. The Horus Lexicanum entry records 2 specific moments from within this period. The Emperor saved Horus's life at the siege of Raylis. Horus repaid that debt on the planet of Goro, hacking the arm off a frenzied orc that had the Emperor pinned by the throat. 2 of the most dangerous entities in the setting, covering each other's flanks under live fire conditions. The specificity of the Goro intervention is worth pausing on. To successfully intervene in time to save the Emperor, to close the distance, identify the threat, and remove the threat before the outcome changed, Horus had to be operating at full situational awareness within what was presumably a chaotic, close engagement environment. That's not a student watching a master from the bench. That's a student responding to an emergency at the master's level in real time, demonstrating that 30 years of proximity had genuinely compressed the capability gap to a range where mutual survival was possible. No other Primarch has this. Russ received some personal instruction from the Emperor after his discovery in 819 M30, but Russ was found 21 years into Horus's exclusive access period and never received anything close to 3 consecutive decades of undivided proximity. By the time the lion was found in 846 M30, the emperor had been dividing his attention among at least a dozen recovered primarchs for years. The personal proximity Horus received, 30 consecutive years of undivided access during the most formative campaigns of the Crusade, before any brother diluted the relationship, is categorically different from what any other primarch received. The defense isn't overstating this. No comparable figure exists in the primary sources for any other son. The prosecution frames the lion's Caliban decade as the foundation of instinctive lethal capability built against apex predators in a death world. The defense doesn't dispute the value of that. What the defense argues is the structural difference between capability forged in isolation against local apex predators, however genuinely lethal those predators were in their specific ecological context, and capability refined in sustained live combat proximity to a being whose combat knowledge represents the absolute ceiling of what has ever existed in this setting. One is exceptional raw material. The other is 30 years of exposure to the most complete refinery that exists anywhere in the galaxy. These aren't comparable categories. No amount of innate gift fully bridges that gap without the equivalent duration of equivalent exposure. Defense Exhibit B, the structure of no exploitable weakness. Leman Russ is physically stronger than Horus. The Dulon incident comparison, which the prosecution itself introduced, makes this explicit. Russ is described as slightly stronger than the lion, and the lion is placed in physical parity with Horus. Magnus the Red operates at a psychic level that places him categorically outside the normal Primarch range. Angron has more raw berserker combat output than any Primarch who retains tactical judgment, which is part of why the Butcher's nails are treated as an existential modification rather than a simple enhancement. Per the prosecution's own case, the lion has more individual combat speed and more instinctive dueling capability than Horus. Horus concedes all of those individual comparisons without losing the argument, because the question isn't who wins a single isolated attribute comparison. The question is who wins a direct engagement between two Primarchs operating in the same physical tier, where one has a specific exploitable weakness and the other doesn't. The fandom wiki's characterization of Horus across his Great Crusade entry is specific. While many of his brothers and the Space Marine legions created in their genetic image were gifted in specific fields of military science, Horus was a natural leader. His greatest genius, his ability to meld seemingly divergent allies into a coherent whole. The framing throughout is consistently about uniform excellence rather than domain supremacy. He isn't the fastest. He isn't the strongest. He isn't the most psychically gifted. He's the one against whom no single axis attack can end the fight quickly, because every axis has been developed past the point where it can be cleanly exploited. The prosecution's strongest specific argument is that the lion's primal instinctive style resists the psychological reading that constitutes Horus's primary tactical advantage. Lord of the First does describe that style in terms that support this claim, and the prosecution used it correctly. The defense's partial response is that 30 years of live combat exposure to the Emperor, a being who doesn't win fights by outthinking opponents, but by being the most dangerous physical entity in the material universe, provides a specific counter-curriculum. Whatever Horus absorbed from those 30 years necessarily included how to engage opponents whose instinct and physicality outpace the cognitive reading approach. The Emperor fights well below the level where psychology applies in the way it applies to normal beings. His student was watching and absorbing that process for 3 decades across live engagements. Defense Exhibit C, the Emperor's Investment. Worldbreaker. The Warhammer 40K fandom wiki is specific. It was personally crafted and presented to him as a gift by the Emperor of Mankind when he was named as the Imperial War Master. The Lexicanum confirms. Said to be crafted by the emperor's own hands, it was given to Horus as a gift when he was named War Master of the Great Crusade. A power maul whose spiked head alone, per the fandom wiki, was the scale of a full Space Marine warrior's entire armored torso. Horus was the only primarch who could wield it with any grace. Every other Astartes who tried to use it found it too cumbersome. The emperor built this weapon. He built it for Horus specifically. He handed it over at the Ulanor Triumph in 000.M31 on the day he formally transferred command of the Great Crusade, having just spent 30 years watching Horus operate in live combat and having just finished the largest military victory the Imperium had yet achieved. The defense asks the court to consider what that design choice means in concrete terms. The emperor had watched Horus fight across 3 decades of active campaigning. He had seen what situations arose, what opponents were faced, what gaps appeared in Horus's existing toolkit. He then built Worldbreaker, not a sword, not a weapon optimized for precision or speed, but an instrument of overwhelming destructive force that also signified rank, and paired it with the talon of Horus, a lightning claw recovered from Chthoniya as a relic of the dark age of technology, representing variable application at closer range. The emperor designed this specific toolkit. Having watched Horus fight for 30 years, he chose these specific tools for these specific hands and this specific fighting style. The prosecution presents a Chaos Emissary's nickname as the designation for the lion. The defense presents the emperor's own design judgment, translated into forged metal, as the implicit designation for Horus. The Ulanor speech is on the record from the fandom wiki. I name you War Master, and from this day forth, all of my armies and generals shall take orders from you as if the words came from mine own mouth. The defense doesn't claim the War Master selection is purely a combat ranking. It was political and strategic as well. What it demonstrates is that the individual who had fought alongside Horus for 30 years, who had also assessed every other primarch at least briefly by the time of Ulanor in 000.M31, made a judgment that Horus represented the peak of what the primarch program produced when measured across all dimensions simultaneously. That evaluation came from the most qualified judge in the setting, after direct observation of the competition across the entire Great Crusade's opening phase. Both sides have made their cases. Before the verdict, the court needs to be honest about where the evidence is clean, where it's contested, and what the asymmetries between the two piles actually look like. The prosecution has 3 genuine pieces of evidence with real canonical grounding. The Lexicanum consistently positions the lion as the primary reference point when describing the combined prowess of these 2 specific primarchs. The emperor's direct statement in Lord of the First places the lion's victory tally above all others in direct speech without qualification. The Dulan incident, confirmed by Black Library sources summarized across the fandom wiki, establishes physical parity between the lion and Leman Russ, and establishes the lion as the faster combatant within that tier across a 24-hour sustained engagement. The Chaos Emissary's designator of the Duelist identifies the lion's individual combat identity as his defining attribute, in a way that Horus's composite identity as Supreme Commander and Coalition Builder doesn't replicate. These are genuine canonical signals. They describe what the lion is. They describe how the lore consistently frames him relative to Horus. The defense has one piece of evidence that, in isolation, represents the most exclusive factual advantage in this entire trial: 30 documented years of live warfare proximity to the Emperor, confirmed by multiple independent sources, with downstream application also confirmed when Horus operated the Principia Imperialis fleet independently. No other Primarch has an equivalent. The structural, no exploitable weakness argument is a secondary pillar, coherent and consistent with how the lore depicts Horus across multiple novel entries, but not independently decisive. The Emperor's investment in designing Worldbreaker specifically for Horus is a supporting exhibit. It's suggestive. It isn't proof. The prosecution's evidence is predominantly descriptive and categorical. Labels applied by the lore, comparative framings in reference documents, an adversary's nickname, the Emperor's praise of a victory tally covering campaigns and conquest, rather than explicitly a staged individual duel between these two primarchs specifically. These are genuine canonical signals. They're not staged outcomes. The lore does not place Lion L. Johnson and Horus Lupercal in the same room, in the same fight, pre-Davin, and show one of them walking out. The entire trial is built on inference from comparative evidence, which is why the debate is still running in the comments. There's one more asymmetry worth naming directly. The Lion's pre-heresy documented fight record carries more specific outcome data than Horus's pre-corruption direct duel record. The Dulon Brawl has a confirmed duration, a confirmed outcome description, and specific attribute comparisons recorded. Horus's pre-corruption direct combat record in Primarch versus Primarch terms is thinner in documented specifics. The Ulanor Crusade was a joint operation with the Emperor, not a solo feat. The Corax incident was a single blow in an argument, not a sustained engagement. The opening Horus Heresy novels establish Horus's authority and physical presence through commanding scenes and combat descriptions, rather than extended Primarch versus Primarch duels with recorded outcomes comparable to Dulon's data richness. The narrative asymmetry runs in Horus's favor. More pages, more scenes, more presence. The outcome data asymmetry runs the other direction. The verdict. The court finds for the prosecution. Pre-heresy, in a direct one-on-one engagement, the weight of canonical evidence gives the Lion the edge. The Lexicanum's framing positions the Lion as the reference point and Horus as the qualifier, not the other way around. The Emperor's direct statement in Lord of the First ranks the Lion's tally of victories as second to none among all his sons, delivered by the individual with the clearest possible view of both Primarchs' output across the entire Great Crusade. The Dulon incident places the Lion in confirmed physical parity with a Primarch in Horus's combat tier, while establishing the Lion as faster, and speed at this level across a sustained engagement is the variable that decides contests between otherwise equally matched opponents. The adversaries of the Imperium, with full intelligence access to all 20 Primarchs, chose the Lion as the one whose identity was built on individual combat supremacy. The Lion's primal instinctive fighting style creates a specific structural problem for the psychological reading that constitutes Horus's primary combat intelligence advantage. The defense's 30-year argument is the strongest single piece of evidence presented in this trial. It doesn't lose because it's weak. It loses on a narrow margin because the canonical language of the setting consistently frames the outcome of those 30 years in a specific way. Horus emerged from them as a rival to the Lion's standard. The Emperor, the very person who watched all of it unfold, who experienced 30 consecutive years of what that training produced, and who subsequently met the Lion, said in direct speech that the Lion's tally was second to none. That direct assessment is difficult to set aside. The Lion, narrowly, on evidence. Here's the ammunition the Horus faction should carry into the comments, because they're not wrong to carry it. The verdict was close. 30 years is the argument that deserved to come closer to winning than it did, and the Horus faction can legitimately argue it should have won outright. The prosecution's strongest evidence is language, the Lexicanum's comparative framing, a Chaos emissary's nickname, the Emperor's praise of a victory tally covering campaigns and conquest. Lord of the First's Paragon designation is a novel blurb characterization applied by an author, not a staged fight scene between these two specific Primarchs. None of the prosecution's primary evidence explicitly stages a fight between Lion L. Johnson and Horus Lupercal pre-Davin and shows the Lion walking out. The prosecution describes what the lion is and positions him favorably in canonical language. Favorable positioning in language isn't the same as a staged outcome, and a Horus advocate who makes that distinction clearly and consistently is standing on real ground. The defense's central evidence is 30 consecutive years of live combat exposure at the absolute ceiling of this setting. That's not a framing. That's a documented duration confirmed by multiple independent canonical sources. The fandom wiki states it. The Lexicanum confirms it. The downstream effect on Horus's solo performance is documented when he takes command of the Principia Imperialis fleet, and the lessons of 3 decades apply immediately to outcomes. No other primarch has an equivalent. Not Russ, found 21 years into Horus's exclusive access period. Not the Lion, found 48 years in. The prosecution required the court to treat canonical language as more decisive than documented experience. The court did so by a slim margin. A Horus advocate who builds their case specifically around the 30-year pillar, without overstating it, without claiming it grants Horus superiority in every individual attribute, simply arguing that 30 years of live combat exposure to the greatest warrior in existence isn't fully outweighed by the direction of a comparative adjective in a wiki entry, is standing on verified lore that this verdict outweighed but didn't answer. The Emperor chose Horus. After 30 years of direct observation of what Horus could do, after seeing what all his other sons produced, the most qualified judge in the setting made a choice. He didn't choose the Lion. The Horus faction should bring that argument into the comments and build on it. That's the fight this verdict was designed to start. Subscribe for more stories like this.